Delve into the untold chapters of Death Row, a realm where life teeters on the edge of oblivion. Unveiling the fragile boundaries between life and death, we bring you closer to the heart of humanity, revealing tales of audacity, resilience, and despair. Join us as we explore the shadows of the condemned and witness the profound narratives that are often left untold.
It was almost evening on May 31st, 1984, and all was not right at Mecklenburg Correctional Center in Virginia. Unbeknownst to the prison guards, an evil plan was just about to be put into motion by a rowdy gang of 6 inmates. Linwood and James Briley, Lem Tuggle, Earl Clanton, Derek Peterson, and Wiley Jones had all been sentenced to death, but they weren't going to sit around and wait for justice to be served. All 6 men were killers of vile reputations, but the worst of them were by far the Briley Brothers, who seemed to rule over the entire death row. Back in 1979, Linwood and James Briley, their younger brother Anthony, and an accomplice, Duncan Meekins, had been part of a ruthless 7-month killing spree in their hometown of Richmond, Virginia. Their killing spree took 11 lives that we know of and left many others in distress. The brothers and their accomplice were all arrested soon after committing the last murders. Duncan Meekins and Anthony Briley were given life sentences in prison because there was not enough proof that any of them had personally committed the murders. Linwood and James Briley were both sentenced to death. Evidence showed Linwood and James were both directly responsible for committing the murders. They were sent to death row in Mecklenburg Correctional Center in early 1980. By now, it was time to leave their past behind and start fresh, away from Mecklenburg. By all accounts, Linwood Briley was the mastermind behind the escape plan. In 1984, at 30 years old, Linwood was charismatic, smart, and merciless. His brother James, who was 28, was far more placid and incapable of devising a complex plan. According to various descriptions, James had the face of a man who was born to die in the electric chair. He wasn't bright like Linwood, and he was cold. So it fell to Linwood to think things through, get the necessary resources for the escape, and gather up the other inmates. Finding people willing to break out of prison wasn't hard at all. After all, these men were sentenced to death. Even more, Linwood was popular and feared, which certainly helped convince the others. With Tuggle, Clanton, Peterson, and Jones now in tow, freedom was just around the corner. The men could probably almost taste it, and there was nothing that could hold them back. There had been some recent trouble, some months ago. Several other inmates had alerted prison officials about the Brileys' plan to break out of Mecklenburg. As a result, the prison officials instituted a general lockdown from April 1984 until the end of May, when bureaucrats and human rights watchers pressured the officials to put a stop to the lockdown. And now, it was time for the Brileys' plan to become a reality. It was an evening on May 31st. Earl Clanton was the first one out of the 6 to act. As inmates were going back to the cell blocks for the night, Clanton slipped out of the line and into a bathroom adjacent to the control room. Then he proceeded to lock himself in the bathroom, unnoticed by any of the guards. A while later, at about 9 p.m., James Briley asked the guard in the control room if the man could retrieve a book for him in the locked day room. The guard left to retrieve the book, and that's when James Briley and Clanton attacked, overpowering the officer. After they took hold of the control room, James and Clanton started hitting buttons, essentially unlocking the cells and opening doors. Mayhem ensued, but it was only the beginning. The Brileys had spent months, even years, studying the prison guards, their patterns, their behaviors, their protocols, even their personal gestures. This gave the prisoners a huge advantage. It meant they knew where to go, when to go, and how to proceed overall. With all the doors in the unit now unlocked, and the feeling of insurgency in the air, the inmates easily overpowered the prison guards. The guards were stripped of their clothes, tied up, and forced in the cells. The 6 inmates changed into uniforms and started acting like guards. This was the next step of the prisoners' plan. They had to act like guards and radio officers in the areas of the prison. The reason was simple. They wanted to lure all officers to the building they now controlled. Each time a guard entered the unit, the convicts attacked them. They had weapons. The Brileys and their accomplices spent months turning lawn equipment into deadly devices. Each time a guard would show up to the building, James Briley and Lem Tuggle threatened them with makeshift blades. There were instances of mercy. The older Briley meant to sexually assault a prison nurse, but he was also stopped by another inmate. Officer Coraline Epps, who had just had a baby, also feared she was about to be raped and killed, but she too had an unlikely protector. Despite being one of the 6 inmates who had planned the entire escape, Earl Clanton came to Epps' defense. telling her quietly that he was a dad. "I'm not going to let anyone come in here and hurt you. You have my word," Clanton told the woman. Then he proceeded to stay in front of the door, protecting her. As the minutes passed, the Brileys knew they were getting closer to their escape, but in order to reach the second portion of their plan, they needed the presence of one guard in particular. Then, they saw the man entering the building. One of the 6 inmates ambushed the officer, putting a blade to his throat. He had to listen and obey if he wanted to live. With the blade still pressed to his throat, the officer called other prison officials and told them the inmates had assembled a bomb and he needed to get it out of the prison before it detonated. He also asked for a prison van to be sent to the back of the unit so that the bomb could be carried away safely. Meanwhile, the Brileys and the other 4 inmates had to find something that could easily pass for a bomb. They raided a closet and put on riot gear. This way, their faces would be unseen by the prison guards they might encounter along the way. Then they placed a television on a gurney and covered it with a blanket. Their so-called bomb looked authentic enough. It was time to leave this hellhole, but not before getting fire extinguishers too. Just another touch of authenticity to their ruse. Linwood Briley, James Briley, Lynn Tuggle, Earl Clanton, Derek Peterson, and Willie Jones exited the building carrying the gurney. The van was waiting for them at the back of the building. Nobody even batted an eye at the 6 men. They looked the part of prison officials carrying a bomb. Then the men entered the van, and away they went. The guard in charge of opening the prison's 2 sets of gates had her suspicions about the van, but in the end, she let the vehicle pass. And then, the 6 killers were out, free at last. They had $800 between the 6 of them because they had raided the pockets of each and every prison guard they'd come across. They had cigarettes and clothes, and a strong intention of heading up north to Canada, a country that abhorred capital punishment and wouldn't have extradited anyone who would be sent back to a country to be executed. Eventually, the 6 inmates abandoned the van and split up. By then, the manhunt was already on. There was no bush, door creak, sound, or rumor left unchecked. Earl Clanton Jr. and Derek Peterson were caught first, the day after the breakout. Lynn Tuggle Jr. and Willie Leroy Jones almost managed to get to Canada, but they too were soon captured by the police. The Briley brothers were harder to catch, but in the end, they too were apprehended. They stuck together and might have even managed to escape, were it not for Lynn Tuggle. Once he was caught, Tuggle told officers the Brileys were dropped off outside Philadelphia. Police knew the 2 brothers had family there. When a tapped line on a Briley Brothers acquaintance in New York showed a phone call from a Philadelphia garage, police knew they had the brothers in the bag. The Brileys were barbecuing chicken in the alley when they were arrested. None of the 6 inmates are alive today. They were all executed after being recaptured. Both Linwood and James Briley were executed in the electric chair at the Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond. Linwood was executed in October 1984, while James was executed in April 1985. Earl Clanton's execution was carried out in April 1988. Derek Peterson's execution followed in August 1991. Willie Leroy Jones was executed in the electric chair in September 1992. The last of the 6 to die was Lynn Tuggle, who chose lethal injection. He was executed on December 12, 1996. His final words were, "Merry Christmas."
Raymon Riles was born on the 1st of June, 1950 in Harris County, Texas. Not much is known about his childhood or general background. What we do know, however, is that Riles only completed 7 years of education and later went on to work as a truck driver. His criminal record began when he was a juvenile, and it included everything from burglary, robbery, and even attempted rape. Riles was a violent man, one who instilled fear in those around him. Once, during one of his episodes, he tried to tie his own wife to a railroad track as a train neared, while calling her Jezebel and yelling at her to repent for crimes unknown. So nobody that knew Riles was really taken by surprise by the events that landed him straight on death row. It was December 11, 1974, when 25-year-old Raymon Riles and his friend Herbert Washington showed up to John Henry Motors, a used car dealership in Houston. Riles and Washington weren't there to buy a car. They just wanted to have a word or two with John Henry, the dealership's owner. Washington had bought a car from John Henry a while before, but the vehicle turned out to be rather disappointing. The car had many problems, and Riles and Washington felt they'd been swindled by 31-year-old John Henry. Unbeknownst to Henry, both Riles and Washington were armed with guns. Riles and Washington approached Henry. It was obvious they meant business, but Henry had yet to discover just how awfully serious they were about the whole deal. The two demanded a refund of the down payment. Unfortunately, Henry wasn't aware of the real danger lurking, waiting to snatch him. Henry didn't want to refund the money, but he had another proposition. He would repair the car, all free of charge. But his generous offer wasn't enough, not to these particular people. Raymon Riles pushed Henry and drew his gun, shooting the man from behind. After the deed was done, an unfazed Washington and a probably even more unfazed Riles went to a local restaurant to inquire about job openings. But the manager refused to give the man job applications. This proved to be a mistake. Riles and Washington were furious. They took their guns out and robbed the manager and his wife at gunpoint before leaving with around $1,800 in cash. After they left, the manager called the police and provided a description of the robbers, which ultimately led to their arrest. As you can imagine, Riles and Washington had no intention of getting arrested. A frantic police chase ensued at speeds of up to 100 miles per hour, but it wasn't too long until Washington crashed the car into a truck. The men whipped out their guns and exchanged gunfire with the police before running away on foot. As they were running, Washington was shot in the hand. This slowed him down considerably, giving officers the time to apprehend him. Riles never once looked back, nor did he stop when his arm was wounded too. Instead, the 25-year-old entered a nearby home, hoping to at least get a respite. He was probably sure he could easily subdue the owner of the house, but that's exactly where his luck ran out. The owner of the house turned out to be a police officer, who managed to place a tourniquet on Riles' arm and held him down until help arrived. Riles and Washington were apprehended the same day, but from here, their stories differ dramatically. Washington was initially sent on death row, but he wasn't the one to commit the murder, so his conviction was later thrown out. He was then sentenced to 50 years in jail for the part he played in the gunfire exchange, but Washington was granted parole in 1983, 9 years after that fateful day in December 1974. But there was no doubt who had pulled the trigger. Raymon Riles stood trial for the murder, and nothing his lawyer said in his defense was enough to change his sentence. Once Riles' trial started, it was more than obvious that the man wasn't mentally sane. Riles had multiple outbursts during the trial. He broke things, yelled at the judge and prosecution team, and even tried to attack the judge. Expert witnesses testified Riles was completely mentally ill. According to their expertise, Riles had delusions, psychotic thoughts, and most likely suffered from schizophrenia. The medical history of Riles' family was also deemed irrelevant. Many members of his family had been committed to mental health facilities over the years. A psychiatrist testified Riles acted like a dog when she tried to interview him. Despite this glaring evidence that Raymon Riles was mentally ill, the prosecutor chose to believe it was all an act on Riles' part, the man's desperate attempt to escape the capital punishment. The court seemed to agree. They even claimed it didn't matter that Riles was mentally ill. If anything, that was reason enough to have him sent on death row, where he would no longer be a threat to society. Riles was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in 1976. His first conviction and death sentence were later overturned on appeal because prosecutors had used evidence from the restaurant armed robbery at Riles' murder trial. But the matter was settled in 1978, and Riles was sent back on death row in no time. He was one of 10 death row inmates who signed a petition declaring their intention to stop pursuing further appeals and asking to be executed as soon as possible. Perhaps Riles believed the authorities didn't move fast enough, or perhaps he had a deal with the voices inside his head. It was May 20th, 1985, when other inmates saw Riles talking to himself, eating grass, rolling in the dirt, and trying to communicate with Mother Earth and Allah while he was in the recreation yard. The next day, Riles surrounded himself with piles of papers, Bibles, and other books and lit a match. He wanted to go, and fire was as good a way as any other. But his suicide attempt was unsuccessful. Riles was found just in time, and he was rushed to the hospital with severe burns on 30% of his body. In 1986, the Supreme Court declared that states may not execute people who did not understand why they were being executed, people that should be legally classified as incompetent. But despite the fact that Riles was obviously mentally unstable, and even medication did little to help him, this new ruling was overlooked in his case. He was scheduled to die by lethal injection on September 17, 1986, and for the first time, it looked like the state was serious about it. The Supreme Court ruled that despite the glaring evidence Raymon Riles was mentally ill, the execution would go ahead. And it probably would have happened were it not for a separate claim from Riles' attorneys that black men with white victims were disproportionately sentenced to death. Riles' execution was stayed 2 hours before it should have taken place. Riles had another execution date in 1988, but it never happened. It was the last execution date Riles ever received. Years of isolation turned Riles' mental health for the worse, but not all officials believed in the severity of the inmate's condition. Riles' attorneys decided to petition the courts for a new sentence. They claimed that potential mitigation factors such as Riles' mental illness had been overlooked during his initial trial. In February 2021, Harris County District Attorney Kim Ogg expressed her support to Riles' case. Ogg explained that certain factors must be considered before a defendant is sentenced. Furthermore, she said, Raymon Riles deserved to be treated the same way defendants who are being sentenced today are. Riles' resentencing hearing took place on June 9, 2021. He appeared on Zoom and not in person due to his poor health. Riles suffered from heart disease and prostate cancer, which put him at high risk of contracting COVID-19. State District Judge Anna Martinez resentenced Raymon Riles to life in prison. At the time of Riles' sentencing, Texas did not give terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Raymon Riles spent 45 years on death row, making him the nation's longest-serving death row prisoner. He's currently 72 years old and still in prison. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles is expected to conduct a parole review in his case. By all accounts, Scott Dozier was an exceptional guy. He was smart and charming, caring, artistically gifted, and highly intelligent. He was also a murderer, though Dozier himself had never admitted his cruel acts. Before becoming a murderer, though, Dozier had been a mostly happy kid with a mostly good family. Scott Dozier was born on November 20th, 1970, in Great Falls, Montana. Dozier's early life seemed to be almost perfect. In reality, things weren't exactly as good as they seemed. As a young boy between the ages of 5 and 7, Dozier later told a psychologist he had been molested by a teenage boy. By the 8th grade, Dozier found himself doing time at a juvenile detention facility, probably because of his newly found call as a drug dealer. Dozier ended up selling marijuana and LSD all throughout high school. By the time Dozier was in his mid-20s, he was a far cry from the caring boy he'd once been. And it was drugs that ultimately led to his downfall. In 1995, Dozier was arrested in North Las Vegas with Valium, meth, and Rohypnol. In 1998, a home he lived in Las Vegas exploded under mysterious circumstances. The whole deal awfully reeked of a meth lab explosion, but this suspicion was never proved. Soon enough, Dozier's crimes turned from producing and selling methamphetamine to murdering his drug associates. It was April 18, 2002, when Scott Dozier met Jeremiah Miller at La Concha, a motel on the Las Vegas Strip. In April 2002, Miller was eager to learn how to cook meth. He was an addict and looking for a way to earn money for his habit. Dozier had promised to help Miller buy a key ingredient in the production of methamphetamine. Miller brought $12,000 in cash for the purchase. Witnesses disagree whether the drug deal went through or not, but late on the night of April 18, 2002, Jeremiah Miller called his girlfriend and told her he would see her the next day. It was the last time anyone heard Miller's voice. Scott Dozier killed Jeremiah Miller. There was no time for Miller to react, to try and save himself. He was dead in a matter of seconds. What followed next is a gruesome testimony to Dozier's real nature. Scott Dozier sawed Miller's body into multiple pieces. He severed Miller's head and arms. He stuffed the rest of the remains into a suitcase, which he then dumped near an apartment complex in western Las Vegas. But unbeknownst to the murderer, his downfall was already in the making. There was a teeny-tiny detail he had forgotten, and this teeny-tiny detail eventually would lead authorities straight to his doorstep. The suitcase was discovered by a worker the following week. Without a head and arms, it was hard for investigators to figure out the victim's identity, so they had to be creative. They asked Miller's family whether he had any distinctive marks. 2 tattoos, they said. Meanwhile, Dozier was living his best life. He'd stolen the $12,000 Miller had brought for the drug deal and was now spending them to his heart's desire. But as soon as news of the newly discovered severed body broke out, Dozier realized he'd made a mistake. He had forgotten to remove the tattoos from Miller's skin. Dozier was arrested in Arizona about 2 months after Miller's body was found, on June 25, 2002, after a witness told the police he had seen a severed head in Dozier's room at the La Concha Motel. Once Scott Dozier was arrested, he was also connected to the July 27, 2001 murder of Jason Griffin Green, another one of his drug associates. Doug Powell, a former drug associate of Dozier's, told police of Green's murder and confessed that he and another man had helped Dozier dispose of Green's remains. Powell then led authorities to Green's decomposed remains in the desert north of Phoenix. Scott Dozier was given a 22-year sentence in 2005 for killing Green. He was then extradited to Nevada, where he stood trial for Miller's murder. The case against Scott Dozier relied heavily on the testimony of a few of Dozier's friends. These people were all criminals too, which means they didn't testify against Dozier out of the goodness of their hearts, but because they hoped for gentler sentences for themselves. Joe Wolslager, a military veteran who would often get high with Dozier, said Dozier had called him one night. The call was unusual. Dozier was out of breath. His words were even more peculiar. Dozier told Wolslager he was on his way to a lake because he had a body in a suitcase. Dozier proceeded to tell Wolslager the body belonged to Jeremiah Miller, whom he just shot and dismembered. Jerry Wimberly, a neighbor of Dozier's and a fellow meth user, had gone to La Concha Motel to buy meth from Dozier. But before sealing their transaction, Dozier encouraged Wimberly to go into the bathroom to see something. Once inside the bathroom, Wimberly was met with a gruesome sight. The headless body of a man was lying beside the bathtub, with his detached head sitting on his chest and the shower running. La Concha employee Joe Minarson told the court Dozier asked to borrow cement, a dolly, and a bucket on April 18, 2002. Dozier never returned them. Dozier tried to argue that there was a lack of physical evidence to prove he'd murdered Miller, but the prosecution deemed the large number of witnesses proof enough. Scott Dozier was found guilty and received a death sentence on October 3, 2007. Unlike most other death row inmates, Dozier had no intention to keep appealing the decision in order to buy himself more time. He also knew that, despite the fact that Nevada gives numerous death sentences, the sentences are rarely carried out. Most inmates spend their lives on death row and die of old age in prison. As such, the death sentence is often more a formality. In a sense, Nevada wasn't really prepared to carry out Dozier's sentence. But once Dozier had officially waived his legal appeals and asked a Las Vegas judge to set a date, Nevada officials knew they had to start working on making the sentence a reality. "I don't want to die," Scott Dozier said. "I just would rather be dead than do this." In other words, Dozier feared living the rest of his life in prison. Dozier's request spurred a frenzy of preparations involving a lot of different officials and authorities. On November 9, 2017, Dozier's execution was stayed at the request of his lawyers because there were problems regarding the composition of the lethal injection. Prison officials wanted to use an unusual combination of drugs for the injection, including fentanyl, diazepam, and cisatracurium, a paralytic. But there were concerns regarding this drug cocktail, which some believed it would cause a painful death. Despite the fact that Dozier claimed he didn't care how he died, he let his lawyers litigate so as to save other inmates from a painful death. 5 days before the execution date, the judge declared that the paralytic shouldn't be part of the cocktail. On June 19, 2018, the judge signed a new death warrant for Dozier, permitting his execution to take place in the week beginning Monday, July 9, 2018, with Nevada now in possession of the right drugs for the execution. But once again, the execution was halted. The company producing one of the drugs hadn't consented to being associated with the death penalty. Another lengthy lawsuit commenced. Meanwhile, Scott Dozier was getting desperate. He didn't want to live anymore. At some point, he decided to take matters into his own hands and attempted suicide. He's tried to procure deadly drugs, and he even had his sister send him a razor and instructions on how to cut his carotid. His suicide attempts were stopped, and Dozier was put on suicide watch. But his lawyers argued the suicide watch, or the way it was enforced, was inhumane. Dozier was completely isolated. He wasn't allowed to leave his cell. He wasn't allowed to keep in touch with his family. He wasn't even allowed to read. As such, he was getting increasingly depressed, waiting for his sentence to be carried out. But authorities didn't move fast enough for Scott Dozier. The man took matters into his own hands. He waited for the suicide watch to end. He waited to be all by himself, alone in his cell. He waited, and then he took his bedsheet and attached it to an air vent inside his cell. Then he hung himself. Scott Dozier's body was found on January 5, 2019. He was pronounced dead at 16:35.